I guess when you make headlines for hiring a 28-year-old coordinator as well as veteran defensive coordinator, there's going to be a lot of questions that people are suddenly going to have about what the Bears' needs are, who are the other coaches going to be, plus what to make of tailoring the offense to Caleb Williams. What's up? Welcome into the Halas Beat YouTube show brought to you by the Bear Report. I'm Usayd Koshul. He's Nick Whalen. You can follow us on Twitter at Halas Beat, at Usayd Koshul, at _Nick Whalen. I mean, dude, we finally got to hear from Declan Doyle as well as Dennis Allen. We are hearing all this good stuff about the Bears down at the Senior Bowl and how they're looking at guys like Jackson Slater from Sacramento State, I believe. Now questions sort of become, what specifically are the Bears doing when it comes to some of these hires that haven't been made, especially knowing they're looking at players from very specific offensive systems?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point. I mean, the first thing, the Declan Doyle thing, I liked what I heard. I mean, he's just it didn't seem like he has a big ego. A kid, I'm gonna call him a kid because he's 10 years younger than me, who's excited. He's energized. He knows what his role is. He's going to be doing install and a lot of the grunt work stuff that he's been doing as a student assistant, which is something that I can, remember my days of doing that stuff. He's going to be doing a lot of that stuff for the offense, which is great. And then I know there was some pushback. People were like, well, I don't know, Press Taylor, like, he was so bad as an OC. He's not calling plays. Like, people forget that, there are coordinators that are good and they're not good head coaches, but they can go back and be good coordinators. Like, Press Taylor was a good passing game coordinator with the Eagles. So, like, I like the hire, man. So some of those things that I like, and then we'll get more into it later, but I do like the Bill Johnson hire too, a veteran guy that has got it done before and with Dennis Allen.
Yeah, but I think the $1 million question right now in Chicago is, who the hell is the OL coach going to be? Dan Ruchar is a name that comes from the Sean Payton coaching tree, seems to be at the very top of everyone's list right now. I know the Bears were looking to interview the O-line coach at Notre Dame and then the Ohio State O-line coach as well. I tweeted this out on, I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday night, and just for some perspective here, right? Like, Justin Fry is the Ohio State O-line coach right now, and some quick things with him is that the Bears hired Press Taylor a few hours earlier, who was with the Eagles under Chip Kelly as like a quality control coach. Kelly's the offensive coordinator at Ohio State right now. And then obviously, right, like, Justin Fry was Kelly's OC/OL coach at UCLA. Oh, and for the random Boston College connection, because the Ryan Poles Bears seem to always have that Boston College connection. Fry was at Ohio State for Boston College for 5 seasons, right? Okay. So where am I going with this? If we start to look at the type of coach they want to bring in, they're trying to bring in like a scheme transcendent coach, ultimately, is what it is. Because I'm sure you remember, as much as I do, a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, when Chip Kelly was with the Eagles, that was really a sort of revolutionary offense, because it was an offense that a lot of people had not really seen before at the NFL level. It was a lot of, college style concepts that were just so effective that teams then started to say, let's take what these guys are doing in college and start to meet the players with where they're at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, 100%. And it's interesting because you have all these college guys. You're like, well, Ohio State O-line coach or Notre Dame O-line coach, or I guess Tulane's a little bit lower there. But why would they want to leave? They don't want to deal with the NIL, man. Like, it's been a thing. Like, people don't want to deal with this. It's changing college football. But I do agree with you. Like, guys that are really good teachers who are good with a lot of variants of schemes. The other one, you had mentioned Notre Dame's O-line coach, Rudy or Joe Rudolph. He has experience as an OC too, because he had followed Paul Christ, in a couple of his stops as well. So you have some good experience all around. The guy in Tulane was with Dennis Allen and some of this crew in New Orleans. So you're talking about connections. There's lots of connections all around. And to me, it's got me excited because these guys have really good resumes. And it's not like it's like, oh man, I hope we find a O-line coach that's decent. These are top of the end guys. And that's the one thing that I think we continually see throughout this coaching hire process is people want to come to Chicago. It's weird, isn't it? Like it was always just like, oh man, like I just hope we don't mess this up. It's like now, I mean, if you were to think of like a dream scenario, man, it's like, okay, I want us to have like a great elite quarterback prospect. It happened, the trades and the luck, like it happened. We got that prospect. And that's like, man, if we could just get Ben Johnson, like everyone was like mad for like a year. And then it was like this process, like, we're not going to get him. The Raiders are going to get him, or the Jaguars are going to get him. And then we got him. Like, and now we're filling with like really good. It's like everything's coming together. I think it's because people want to be a part of what's going on in Chicago.
I mean, it certainly is a question that you're 110% right about. Like, the Bears have all of a sudden gone from laughing stocks with the Tyreek Stevenson Hail Mary all the way to top tier sort of destinations for a lot of coaches and free agents. And, just talking about the concept of tailoring the offense, like the Senior Bowl to me is where things really kick off for Ben Johnson, right? Because you're going to have all these top prospects down there. The Bears obviously love their Senior Bowl players. We'll kind of talk about the Senior Bowl in another episode after the game on Saturday. But the Bears are now starting to look at very specific players, in terms of the offense, the offensive line. Who do we bring in here to tailor the offense to what Ben Johnson wants to do is what the front office and Ryan Pohl's staff is sort of asking themselves right now, like, who do we need to get in here so that Ben ends up being successful?
Right. And protecting Caleb. And so I got a little research on this. And again, is this what Ben prefers, or is this what just Detroit preferred? But it's very telling, y'all, when you look at the O-line that Ryan Poles has drafted or signed in free agency, has brought in. So if we look, the kind of the projected O-line last year heading into, before camp was Braxton Jones. He weighs 310 pounds. He's a light left tackle. He's really athletic, right? We know that. Tevin Jenkins, 321. He was your mauler. Coleman Shelton, y'all, is 285 pounds. Ryan Bates was 305. I didn't put Nate Davis on there because I think people don't want to hear about him anymore. And then Darnell Wright is 333, so he's big. So really, the Bears had two O-linemen that are big, and everyone else is not. Now, if you look at Detroit's starting O-line, okay? So Taylor Decker is 318, so 8 more pounds than Jones. Graham Glasgow is 315, so 6 pounds less than Tevin Jenkins. That's the only one that they got. Frank Ragnow, 310 as a center. That's 25 pounds heavier than Coleman Shelton. Kevin Zeitler, also a free agent to keep in mind, y'all, from Wisconsin. 332 versus Ryan Bates, 305. And then at right tackle, Penei Sewell is a little bit heavier than Darnell Wright. So that's just the starters, right? So now, like, if you're like, is this a trend, or is that just like luck? Let's look at the backups, okay? And I'll quickly go through this. This is every O-lineman on their roster, okay? It goes 354, 330, 325, 322, 320, 315, and 300. 300 is the only one that's even, like, I would say, light. And that was, I think he's like a backup center or third string center. So everyone's heavy. So if you want to think of like this scheme, Detroit was running duo gap scheme downhill with bigger guys. That doesn't mean they can't move their feet. They have to move their feet, y'all. They have to be athletic. But this outside zone scheme of being light and going east and west, I don't think is going to be what Chicago is going to run. I think it's going to be heavier. You think of like guys that could bring back, man, like Matt Pryor could come back. He would fit this scheme. Coleman Shelton, there's no chance, I don't think.
Yeah, it is a conversation that is certainly going to be worth watching, right? And again, the reason being is because this is a team and front office that they're going to get to a point where ultimately, like Ben has kind of mentioned that, hey, we're going to build this thing around Caleb Williams. Now, what does that even look like? So the first thing to really keep in mind is that when you're building out an offense, okay, and anyone will tell you this. I mean, I've coached offensive line at a high school level, and I will say that offensive line are like socks, dude. Like, they are the most underappreciated gifts that you could get for Christmas. But the big thing to, I think, also keep in mind is that if you want to understand like why Ben Johnson's so successful, it's not because he had this explosive passing offense. Like, the league markets the hell out of the passing game and the quarterbacks. Well, let's call it how it is. Like, that is all the stupid media frenzy that's going to get the people into the seats and buying tickets on Sundays and Mondays and Thursdays. The real reason that Ben Johnson's offense was so successful for 3 straight years is because of the way that the run game basically set the pass game up. And that, you talk about gap scheme. I mean, you mentioned gap scheme, right? And I'm a gap scheme guy. First off, I think that should be an official term in the coaches community, like gap scheme guy. I'm gap scheme because the thing with gap scheme is that there are a million different ways to sort of start tagging things. And so you're showing the same formation, then you're going to run the same exact play, but there's always going to be a little variation or a little wrinkle in that play to the point where it's catching defenses off guard. So like in the case of a guy like a Ben Johnson, let's just say he goes with GT counter as a play, which I know he had the sweet GT counter reverse it was in that playoff loss to Washington, which I don't think was all on him, but that's a separate convo. So GT counter is basically guard tackle counter, right? Your guard and tackle on one side are pulling from backside to play side. To effectively defend counter, you need to have a solution for the C gap. The Bears' run game over the last couple of years, they haven't had a solution for how to defend the front side C gap or the backside C gap, right? Like, it's been horrible. But what happens is the wrinkle now comes into where you're going to run counter and you're still going to pull your guard. But now instead of pulling your tackle, you can still run counter, but make it like GY or GU counter so that you're having an extra guy stay back and account for that C gap. Right? Mm-hmm. It's the same sort of thing with power. Like, power's an A gap run. Well, then how do you account for the backside A gap there? So the reason that, this offense works is because at every point in the run game, every single aiming point, there is a clear aiming point, and then whatever's on the backside, there's always a player there to account for that potential breakdown as well. That could happen.
Yeah, and dressing up formations are cheap and plays are expensive. We think of in the coaching world. And so, I think that that's what he does so well. He makes things look exactly like something else, but there's a slight variation. And that's what kind of, makes the huge plays. Like we were talking about, like, it looks like GT counter right here. The flow is there. Boom. You got the reverse off of it. And it's a huge touchdown. And then people were copying it after that. And the other thing too is I was thinking of like teaching. I know this is a little bit of Hank Fraley, but also Ben Johnson. So Kevin Zeitler got hurt, and rookie Christian Mahogany had to start and did okay as a rookie day 3 pick in the playoffs, which I think is pretty wild. So you think of like you're talking about scheme and stuff, but like doing things where you're putting rookies in good positions to win has me excited about putting Caleb in good positions to win, because, the thing that has me excited, he keeps talking about it, is we're going to take what he does well, or maybe what he wants to do, and that's how we're going to build the offense. It's not going to be like, hey, I'm going to use what I had in Detroit. That's exactly what we're going to run here, because that's a very, I want to say, just like almost archaic coaching philosophy, and mainly it's on the coach. It's like, well, all I know, we were just talking gap scheme. All I know is gap scheme, so that's what we're going to run. Well, if your players are better at zone, or your running backs good at reading zone, your guys are much better going laterally, you should run zone because your players are better at it, not because of what you know. So I was excited about what it could be with Caleb. I think we talked about this on our last episode, but I just keep thinking of building on players' strengths, and that's how you win football games. And it has me excited about 2025 and beyond Chicago Bears.
It really, I know it's only year 2 of the Caleb Williams era right now, but I mean, we're going to find out within the next basically 2 years whether or not Caleb Williams is the guy. Like, there's already people that are kind of coming for his head on Twitter, did that during the season, and now it's going to turn into something where it's more so like, it's going to be like a put up or shut up time for him pretty soon. But you look at the other side of the ball, I mean, there's pieces on both sides of the ball, right? Like, you've got some good pieces to build around on offense, minus the quarterback, obviously. Outside of the quarterback, you've got some good pieces on offense. The other side of the ball is just as intriguing to me, simply because you're not going to have this sort of like Eberflus Tampa 2 defense. You're going to have your base 4-3, but everything now completely changes because your secondary that's a strength is going to continue to be a strength. I wonder if Dennis Allen is going to start moving guys around, right? Like Jalen Johnson, boundary corner.
Yeah.
Could he end up moving to field corner? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I thought you were done.
Yeah, well, I'm saying, right, like Jalen Johnson on the outside, right? Kyler Gordon, a guy that, who, let's call it out, is probably should have been another boundary corner as well, playing on the outside, with Jalen Johnson sort of being the field corner. And then what happens with Tyreek Stevenson at this point? How about the back end of the secondary? Because Dennis Allen, from what I've seen, does not seem to, he likes to play a lot of too high shell. That means that you're not necessarily going to see a 8th guy up in the box all the time.
Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of times now, and that's the game, right? If you have 7 in the box, we're throwing. If you have 6 or less, we're going to be running. And that's the game. And so you try to play 6.5, 7.5 in the box, and that's when you disguise things. I think the exciting thing for me is going to be with this new scheme. It sounds like it's going to be a lot more man coverage. And what's weird is I don't necessarily know how great Jalen Johnson is at man. I don't think he's bad, but I can unequivocally tell you Tyreek Stevenson is better at man coverage than zone. He's a bigger corner, longer corner, use those limbs to press at the line, right? You affect and delay the route stem of the receiver and let him get in the hip pocket instead of him playing off and then them stemming off of him. And all of a sudden he gets turned around. I mean, Terrell Smith gets turned around. Those 2 guys are big and fast. And it's like, put them at the line, make him be a press corner, make the quarterback make a perfect throw to get completions. And I think that could help. And again, we saw with Vic Fangio. Vic Fangio was good in terms of like one corner could even be a press corner, while, Kyle Fuller played more off. Right, they did the things because Prince would press and Fuller would be off. So you again using players' strengths to their advantage. So that part of the scheme has me excited. He also, by name, said he's excited about working with Kyler Gordon, which I would be too, because I think he's fantastic and one of the best nickel corners in the NFL.
I mean, just saying, I believe that there's a legitimate chance that going into year 4 for Kyler Gordon, he takes such a massive jump forward that we're talking about him from the 2022 draft as one of the top defensive players. But I also look at the secondary and I say, like, okay,
real quick on that. I think that means they have to extend him this offseason so he doesn't get so expensive. You know what I mean? Like, I would get ahead of that if I was Ryan Poles.
That was my thought process. So for Bear Report, right, I just did our positional review, and that's one of the things I said is that, yeah, Gordon hasn't had to ever, like, he's never played a full season, but he's always missed a couple games here or there. But I mean, if the chance to extend him comes up this offseason, you kind of take it because it could possibly end up being a fraction of the price. Like, Kyler Gordon to me in this defense is going to be what Marshawn Lattimore was when he first arrived in New Orleans back in like 2016 or 2017. Like, I really think that type of potential is there, because when I look at Marshawn Lattimore and I look at Kyler Gordon, one of the big things I really see is 2 players that are just such good movers in terms of, like, these guys are so slick in how they move. And I do believe that, for all the crap that we gave Tyreek Stevenson on Twitter throughout the season, that Tyreek Stevenson, like you said, the long limbs that he has, he's better at man. That's kind of what Marshawn Lattimore also possesses. I would not be surprised to see both of those guys break out as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the one thing too is it's, Kyler Gordon's so good in the slot, and I know some people are like, the outside corners are all that matters. Man, some of the hardest positions in the NFL to play, I think it's quarterback, and I think nickel corner, and then you could almost go, I think a linebacker, because they're in this stress of there's a runner pass all the time, and they have to guard tight ends, they have to guard slot receivers, and we know what that's like if you have Jack Sanborn out there, So like, there's some really tough positions, but man, I would almost rather have Kyler in the slot and match up with Jordan Addison or Justin Jefferson when they go in there, or Jordan or Jaden Reed. Like, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like, you think of like the best receivers in our division, they're not going to go up against Jalen Johnson. They're going to scheme it and go inside. It's like, I'd rather have our good guy inside than the other outside corner. What about you?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Like, looking at the way these offenses evolve, so we mentioned on one episode that Ben Johnson's never had a starting receiver as big as Rome Odunze is. Yeah. I mean, Tim Patrick was obviously 6'4", but he was the biggest guy in terms of height that the Lions had on the roster. Now, what's so interesting is that from an offensive perspective, you're going to take your Rome Odunze and you are going to move him around a hell of a lot, I think, in my opinion, which just goes back to the concept of Ben tailoring the offense to the personnel that he already has. But you have to move Rome Odunze around from outside to inside the slot to possibly even putting him up, attach him to the line of scrimmage, right? As another basically tight end, but playing receiver. Like, a lot of teams now in the league will kind of call that clamp, in terms of like, you're clamping a guy to the line of scrimmage and he's on the line next to the left tackle or the right tackle, opposite the tight end. And so that ultimately thing is something where, from a defensive perspective, Kyler Gordon's probably, if he continues to play nickel, is going to end up having to follow around the best playmaker that there is. Because under Matt Eberflus, like, you've strictly kept Kyler Gordon in the slot, and now it sounds like if he has to get out there and he has to guard a Justin Jefferson, then he's going to be able to do it. But then also, like, offenses are going to move their receivers around, and so you kind of have to match that personnel and match the game of chess that they're playing with your own game of chess.
Right. And that happens with man coverage, and that happens with disguises, and those are both things Kyler Gordon does well. The other thing that has happened this week is Bill Johnson got hired, and so it doesn't sound like he's definitely the D-line coach. He's probably more of a defensive line assistant. I mean, he's getting up there in age. He has a lot of familiarity with Dennis Allen. He was in New Orleans for a long time, which has me wondering, because, we talk about what the Bears need to do this offseason, and that's something we're going to be talking about in some future episodes. For sure, the D-line needs some help. So they can't find a coach in New Orleans, first off. So you figure there's going to be some changes with whomever comes in. It's not going to be status quo. So I got a list here, man. I got two guys. One's a free agent who had worked with them a little bit this year. Would be Chase Young, right? So it was funny, man. Thinking back to the Montez Sweat trade, remember I can't believe they gave up a 2 for Montez Sweat, and the 49ers got Chase Young for a 3. It was a steal. And now look back at how funny that debate was. But Chase Young's still young. He's still big. He's still athletic. He's got some injury stuff. I looked at some of the PFF numbers. Didn't have as bad a season as you thought. Now, again, he's got a health issue too. Probably a little bit better of a run stopper than a pass rusher. I think he's getting a little bit more into like that Jadeveon Clowney area where he's never going to fully be that awesome pass rusher, but he's a guy you want in your team because he's going to make your team better. So he's a free agent that has some familiarity with, Dennis Allen and Bill Johnson there in New Orleans. The other one is, if they make moves in New Orleans and we start spending on veterans, which is very rare in Chicago, would you sign Cam Jordan if they cut him? Very, very good player for years, getting up there now. But as a guy who, if you spend a first-round pick on a D-end, for example, he could be the mentor for that guy, and he's there for a year or two.
That is a possibility I didn't even consider. Like, I know Chase Young's a free agent at 26, and quite frankly, if I am looking at some of these past trends, like the Ryan Poles being the GM has kind of had this run of, hey, I'm gonna go out and sign guys that my coaching staff is familiar with and has previously worked with, right? Like, you look at last year, the Gerald Everett signing was one, and the Coleman Shelton signings were both because Waldron had worked with Shelton in LA with the Rams, and then Everett, I believe, with the Chargers, or it might have actually been the Rams as well. But they just love to sign these guys that are familiar with the coaching staff that's already in the building. So like Chase Young should now be at the very top of everyone's free agency wish list, because it's like you mentioned. Is he ever going to be the elite pass rusher that he was made to be coming out of Ohio State? No. Is he Jadeveon Clowney 2.0? Yeah, but also let's call it how it is. Like, guys like Jadeveon Clowney and Chase Young are really freaking good players because they don't stuff. Yeah, they don't stuff the stat sheet, but just their mere presence has to force opposing offensive lines and coordinators to basically change up their entire game plan, because they know, all right, well, we can't leave our left tackle one-on-one with this guy because he's going to get that consistent pressure. And if he's not the one getting after the quarterback, he's getting enough pressure to the point where someone else is getting after the quarterback on that defensive line. And again, if you're a guy like a Montez Sweat or a Javon Dexter, quite frankly, you need a Chase Young on your team as a true third threat to allow you to go ahead and do what you're being paid to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other thing too is, I mean, when Darrell Taylor and Austin Booker were in there getting snaps, teams were running at them because they're light and they could just displace them and get huge, massive gaps. And so, that's another part of the chess game, right? Is like, okay, hey, who's in there personnel wise, offensive, defense, and then make their calls. When you got Chase Young in there, it's not going to be an easy way to run. And so, and I know people are like, I care way more about the pass game. I'm telling you, y'all, the run game has been rising the last 2 or 3 years because defenses have gotten lighter boxes. And that's where the difference has been with offenses and winning teams. I mean, look who's in the games right now. The Eagles made the Super Bowl almost purely based on running. And so you can't say that's not important. So I think that's part of it too, is that when you have a big body in there, I know they got Walker too. I wouldn't mind another one. And then you could draft a kid, or, you can still keep working on Booker. But to have a big body like that, I think it is going to be helpful when you have to have guys have rest because, they have 40 or 50% snap share on the D line. They rotate so much. Having another body like that would be good. Cam Jordan is also a big guy, a strong guy. He's not your finesse rusher. So he's definitely good. The other one I think everyone always talks about, man, is Trey Hendrickson. You'd have to trade and then give him a massive contract. Is that anything that you would love to see?
I mean, that really depends, like, what you're trading for him. Because honestly, like, yeah, Trey Hendrickson has been great. The way that I look at it is he really took off in Cincinnati, right? Like New Orleans, whatever. He had 13 and a half sacks his last year, gets set up with the big payday, and then he's had 17 and a half sacks each of the last 2 seasons. So he has been a total freak. Now, my question is, what specifically are you giving up for Trey Hendrickson? And deeper angle here, should it come at the cost of giving up draft picks to forego getting a long-term building block on the offensive line? Like, that to me is an incredibly serious question in terms of, hey, do you go get the guy that's got 35 sacks in the last 2 years that is familiar with Dennis Allen?
Right.
Give him a big deal, give up those draft picks, or do you kind of say, we're going to rely on Dennis Allen, a veteran D coordinator, to figure it out with Montez Sweat. And then also the second thing is use the draft capital to go ahead and to add to the offense. Like, if I were the Bears right now, I would probably, and I know I'm in the minority here, but choose the second option for the sole sake of, you can't delay this overhauling of the offensive line. Like, I'm of the opinion that, and again, a coach's perspective here, that if you go out in free agency, let's say, and you sign Trey Smith, you have to go ahead and you also have to draft a offensive lineman in the first round and maybe even in the second round as well, just to continue to add to the position.
Corey Zabel. He's my guy. We'll talk more about that one moving forward, y'all, but one of my favorite guys at the Senior Bowl. Yeah, and I brought up Hendrickson exactly what you're talking about because he's got a connection with Dennis Allen. Like I'm always trying to put the connect the dots here. But I think I'm with you. Like if it was a 2 this year, 2 next year for Trey Hendrickson, and then you have to pay him $27 million per year, or I signed Chase Young for 10. I think that's kind of what he signed for this year. Like, 1 year prove it deal again or something like that. And you draft somebody on day 1 or day 2. I think I'd rather go that option because again, at some point you have to like replenish the roster here. And I would much rather we're not going to get compensatory picks, y'all. I'd rather just sign guys than give up the pick and to trade for a guy, then sign him. The other caveat though is I heard someone give up a 3 for Trey Smith to be able to sign him, if they tag in with Kansas City and then try to trade him. That was kind of interesting. I feel like I'd be good with that one if Ian Cunningham goes to Jacksonville, but that does not sound to be the case.
I mean, Jacksonville is kind of its own separate question right now. That, again, if Ian Cunningham ends up going there, then cool, the Bears will get a couple third rounders between this year and next year. But it's to your point about Trey Hendrickson. So the Bears right now, per over the cap, have 47 players on the roster. The projection right now before the salary cap jump kicks in and then any additional roster cuts, because there are going to be a few, I think. Yeah. The Bears have $63 million in cap space right now. They spent $112 million on the defense and then $94 million on the offense. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now I understand a big chunk of that, let's just be real, is DJ Moore's extension and then is DeAndre Swift's contract on offense solely. And then Darnell Wright's, 5th-year option, which is going to kick in next year at this time after the 2025 season's over. But I think the point I'm making here is this. It's you spent so much money on the defense. Is it really worth spending another 26, 27 million? I would even say upwards of 30 million to get your defensive spending to 140 million almost. Right. Or do you take that money and do you say, well, we're going to funnel it back into the offense? Because a lot of these teams, and I get the quarterback contract makes the difference, a lot of these teams are willing to stake more dollars into the offense because they recognize and understand, hey, it's a QB-driven league. And to Ben Johnson's point about the league's quarterback-driven, that to me just signals we're going to invest every resource into offense.
Yep, 100% with you. I would much rather spend every pick 1, 2, and 2 on the O-line. And, maybe even round 3, that's when you go running back and sign a couple of 1-year deal defensive guys, then spend heavy on defense, draft heavy on defense, and leave Caleb Williams with not great O-line.
Absolutely. And I fully agree with that. We are a little over that 30-minute mark, so we're going to get out of this place because both of us are not feeling well. But make sure you're following us on Twitter at Halas Beat. Check us out on the Bear Report website. Check us out on Twitter too at Usayd Koshul _Nick Whalen. Make sure that you are liking, following, and subscribing to the YouTube channel. That's going to do it from us. Like I said, bear down. We will see you guys next week for 2 really good episodes when both of us are feeling better. But have a fun and safe weekend, people.